Imagine the narrow, lamplit alleys of the Subura, Rome's infamous pleasure district, thrumming with the sounds of laughter, dice clattering in taverns, and the low murmur of transactions both legal and otherwise. The air is thick with incense, masking the sharper tang of sweat, wine, and cheap perfume. You are a Roman senator, accustomed to marble halls and measured debate, moving quickly through this disreputable quarter for reasons you will not admit in daylight. Then, through the smoky gloom, you see her. At first, it's a vague sense of familiarity, the way her head tilts when she listens, the precise arch of her brow. She leans toward a client, cheap rouge painted over skin you've seen radiant in the imperial palace. And suddenly, the realization lands with the force of a gladiator's blow. This is no common streetwalker. This is Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, wife to Emperor Claudius, on her knees in a brothel, servicing strangers with the casual efficiency of one long practiced in the art. Your stomach turns. It is not the act itself. Rome, after all, has never been prudish about sex. It is the obscenity of who is doing it. This is the most powerful woman in the empire, draped not in purple silk, but in the sweat-stained linen of the city's cheapest working girls. She is here by choice, not compulsion, chasing a thrill no imperial banquet could match. This wasn't some secret tryst in a nobleman's villa. This was deliberate descent into Rome's lowest strata. And worse, she seemed to revel in the competition, measuring herself against the city's most hardened prostitutes, determined to prove she could outlast and outperform them all. You think you know Roman decadence? You've heard the stories of Caligula's banquets, of senators with boys on their laps during Senate sessions. But what Messalina would do over the next 8 years would make Caligula seem like a blushing novice. Her story begins in 38 CE, under the blinding gold of an imperial wedding that promised stability and virtue. Barely 15, Messalina wed Claudius, a man 13 years her senior. To the public, the match embodied everything Rome valued: an alliance between ancient patrician bloodlines, a promise of heirs, the union of nobility and fertility. Claudius himself was an unusual emperor, scholarly, awkward, his gait uneven from what modern medicine might call cerebral palsy. He had been underestimated all his life, ridiculed by his own family, and perhaps was genuinely grateful for the young, beautiful wife who seemed the very image of aristocratic refinement. She bore him children quickly and fulfilled her ceremonial duties without fault. Roman society's moral code was rigid, at least in theory. Women of high rank were to be paragons of chastity and domestic virtue, their influence confined to the household and temple. Prostitution, while legal and common, was considered the lowest occupation for a freeborn woman. The distance between an empress and a brothel worker was meant to be absolute. Crossing it was more than scandal. It was a threat to the state's very image. And yet, behind the guarded gates of the Palatine Palace, the girl empress was already plotting her escapes. To the senators, she was the pale-haired goddess at the emperor's side during solemn processions. To her handmaidens and a few trusted slaves, she was something else entirely, a creature of restless appetite, drawn to the city's underbelly like a moth to flame. In Rome's pleasure districts, the elite and the desperate mingled more freely than in the Senate. Gladiators drank beside scribes, freedwomen beside foreign merchants. The Subura was a place where masks could be worn and removed without fear of gossip reaching the forum. But for an empress, even in disguise, the risk was enormous. One rumor could topple her. Messalina, however, was not merely risking her reputation. She was seeking a kind of victory. In her mind, every encounter in those smoky rooms was a contest, proof that she could endure, seduce, and dominate better than any woman whose livelihood depended on it. And for her, the greater the gulf between her public dignity and her private degradation, the more intoxicating the experience became. Her nocturnal wanderings began as furtive rebellions, slipping past her guards, draped in coarse wool instead of imperial silk, blending into the night crowds. But soon, these excursions became something else, not escape, but conquest. And on one December night, during the festival of Saturnalia, She would cross a line from which she never turned back. When Valeria Messalina entered the imperial family in 38 CE, she was the perfect political ornament. Barely out of childhood, she possessed all the hallmarks of Roman aristocratic beauty: alabaster skin, golden hair, and the finely sculpted features that spoke of generations of patrician breeding. Her lineage was impeccable, a direct link to some of Rome's most revered families, and her youth promised decades of fertility. For Emperor Claudius, who had risen to power almost by accident after the assassination of Caligula, she was more than a wife. She was a symbol. His reign began under a cloud of skepticism. The Senate viewed him as a weak ruler, chosen by the Praetorian Guard more out of convenience than respect. In Messalina, Claudius found legitimacy. Together, they appeared to embody the virtues of the old republic: piety, dignity, and the promise of strong heirs to secure the imperial line. The Roman public adored the image. Messalina gave birth to 2 children within the first years of marriage, attended religious ceremonies with serene composure, and played the dutiful hostess at imperial banquets. Every gesture was deliberate, every public appearance calculated to reinforce the fiction of imperial harmony. But beneath the marble perfection, the young empress lived in a palace that was both gilded and suffocating. Life within the Palatine walls was a careful dance of protocol and paranoia. Every step, every glance, every whisper might be noted by servants whose loyalty could be bought with coin or favor. The imperial household was a nest of rivalries, freedmen and courtiers jostling for influence, senators scheming for appointments, and the emperor himself often distracted by the machinery of governance. For a young woman with restless energy, the role of ornamental consort could feel like a cage. And unlike many imperial wives before her, Messalina did not accept her confinement. She began pushing at the boundaries in subtle ways, sending away her guards earlier than usual, claiming headaches or fatigue as excuses to be alone. Servants noticed her slipping into plain clothing late at night, the rich fabrics and jewels replaced with unremarkable cloaks that concealed her identity. At first, these nocturnal wanderings were explained away as harmless indulgences: a walk in the gardens, perhaps a visit to a temple under cover of darkness to avoid crowds. But the truth was far more dangerous. Messalina was mapping the streets beyond the Palatine, studying the rhythms of the city after nightfall. She observed where the crowds thickened, where the lamps burned low, where the brothels kept their doors open until dawn. Historians like Tacitus would later remark on her calculating nature, noting that she approached her indulgences as if they were military campaigns, scouting locations, studying routines, and building a network of trusted aides who could facilitate her movements. This was not the impulsive behavior of a bored aristocrat. It was the beginning of something systematic. It's important to understand the context. In early 1st century Rome, sexual freedom for men was virtually without limit, but for women, especially women of rank, it was tightly policed. The ideal Roman matron was chaste, modest, and devoted to the household gods. An empress who merely appeared to violate these ideals could destabilize the regime. The mere rumor of impropriety could be weaponized by political rivals. Messalina's actions, therefore, were not just scandalous, they were perilous. One careless encounter could mean disgrace for herself and potentially undermine Claudius's fragile authority. Yet the very danger of it seemed to feed her appetite. Her rebellion began with whispers in the palace corridors that the empress enjoyed mingling with actors and gladiators, that she laughed too loudly at the bawdier entertainments during private feasts. Then came the first reports of her in the Subura, Rome's pleasure district, cloaked and unguarded. At this point, the line between thrill-seeking and self-destruction had not yet been crossed, but the stage was set. All it would take was one night, one decision, for the empress to step fully into the shadows and embrace a life that would one day bring down an emperor. That night came during the chaotic revelry of Saturnalia, when Rome's strict social order was turned upside down, and the empress could disappear into the crowd like any other Roman woman. The 4th of December, 0 CE. The city of Rome throbbed with the chaotic joy of Saturnalia, the one time of year when the rigid hierarchy of the empire bent, and sometimes broke, under the weight of merriment. For 7 days, the streets became a theatre of reversal. Slaves dined as masters. Masters served at their own tables. Gambling, normally frowned upon, was played openly in the streets. Masks and bright costumes concealed identities, and drunken laughter spilled from taverns to temples. Under the cover of this carnival, all manner of forbidden indulgence was possible, and in the Subura Rome's notorious pleasure quarter, Saturnalia's chaos burned brightest. Here, the streets were narrow, the buildings leaning over as if to whisper secrets from one window to the next. Torchlight flickered on painted signs promising music, wine, and the companionship of women and men for hire. On this night, Messalina shed the last of her imperial restraint. Cloaked in coarse wool, her hair bound beneath a scarf, she moved through the crowds unnoticed. She was not here to observe, she was here to participate. According to whispered accounts preserved by the historian Tacitus, she approached a brothel keeper as if she were any wealthy Roman woman seeking adventure. The man, unaware of the imperial danger before him, agreed to her request. She would work in his establishment for one night, serving clients under a false name. The decision was not impulsive. Messalina had been studying this world for months, the layout of the streets, the habits of the prostitutes, the ebb and flow of customers. She was here to test herself, not simply to indulge. What followed shocked even the hardened professionals of the Subura. That night, she did not pace herself or feign reluctance. She worked with a relentless energy, accepting client after client, determined to prove that no one, not even Rome's most celebrated courtesans, could match her stamina. When dawn approached and the other women began to retire, Messalina refused. She demanded more customers, more challenges, until the brothel keeper, fearful for her health, forced her to leave. But she did not leave empty-handed. She left with the certainty that she had found something that thrilled her more than any banquet or festival could. In the months that followed, she returned again and again, perfecting her disguises, cultivating a network of servants who would smuggle her out of the palace. Soon, the brothel was not enough. By 41 CE, her appetites had taken a competitive turn. She began challenging Rome's most famous prostitutes to public contests, wagers on who could service the most clients in a single night. These were not quiet affairs. They drew audiences from the city's elite, who watched in astonishment as their empress degraded herself in full view. The most infamous of these contests pitted Messalina against Sila, a courtesan of legendary endurance. The rules were simple. From sunset to dawn, the woman who entertained the most men would win a fortune in gold. Sila, pacing herself with the skill of a veteran, retired at 25 clients. Exhausted but confident, she believed the night hers. Messalina, however, continued without pause, surpassing 30 before the night ended, and stopping only when no more men could be found. The onlookers, senators, and nobles among them could barely comprehend what they had witnessed. This was no desperate woman driven by poverty. This was the Empress of Rome, choosing humiliation as a kind of triumph. And in that choice lay the most dangerous truth. Messalina had discovered that her power did not diminish in degradation, it grew. The more she shattered the expectations of her role, the more intoxicating the game became. But the contests were only the beginning. Soon, she would turn her secret indulgence into a weapon, one that could topple senators and bend generals to her will. By the spring of 41 CE, Messalina's nocturnal escapades had shifted from reckless indulgence to something more deliberate, even strategic. What had begun as a dangerous thrill in the back rooms of the Subura was now an operation, complete with logistics, disguises, and loyal agents. Her servants, hand-picked for absolute discretion, became her accomplices. They arranged for wigs and garments so convincing that even those who had seen her in the palace that very day would not recognize her in the street. They mapped escape routes from the palace that avoided the Praetorian Guard, and they ensured that her returns before dawn left no trace for Claudius or his household to detect. She learned to adopt entire alternate identities. a freedwoman newly arrived from the provinces, a merchant's widow desperate for coin, a seasoned courtesan returning to her trade. Each role allowed her to move through the city's underworld without suspicion and to experience the intoxicating double life of empress by day, harlot by night. But Messalina was not content with secrecy alone. The contests with Sila and other famous courtesans had revealed something she could not resist: public spectacle. These events drew not only Rome's thrill-seekers but also its political class, and the mixture of their awe, disgust, and complicity gave her a kind of power she had never wielded before. In Roman culture, the brothel was not simply a place for sex, it was a social crossroads, a forum of vice where gossip flowed as freely as wine. Soldiers, sailors, merchants, and senators all passed through its doors. By inserting herself into this world, Messalina was not merely indulging an appetite. She was placing herself in the path of information, and the information was plentiful. Drunken confessions, loose boasts about political schemes, whispered deals made in the afterglow, all could be overheard or coaxed from the mouths of men who never imagined that the woman beside them could one day use their words as a weapon. Her ambitions expanded. If a single night in the Subura could yield such revelations, what might a controlled, permanent establishment offer? Messalina began to envision a network not of pleasure, but of power, where her body and the bodies of others would be baited hooks for Rome's most dangerous fish. She experimented first on a small scale, arranging clandestine gatherings in discreet villas. The guest list was carefully curated: senators with questionable loyalties, military tribunes with ambitions beyond their rank, merchants whose fortunes rested on imperial contracts. The entertainment was exquisite, the wine intoxicating, the company compromising. For many of these men, the realization of who they had touched or who had touched them came only after the fact, when the cost of speaking out became apparent. Messalina was learning the psychology of control, and she was ruthless in applying it. By 42 CE, she was ready to transform her secret vice into a fully fledged imperial enterprise. And once she crossed that threshold, the boundary between the personal and the political, between the bedchamber and the Senate floor, would dissolve entirely. In 42 CE, Messalina stepped beyond scandal into something Rome had never seen before: a criminal empire draped in silk and guarded by the Praetorian Guard itself. It began with a villa. On the surface, it was a fashionable retreat near the Campus Martius, a place where senators might attend literary readings or dine in private. But behind its gilded doors, Messalina had constructed a brothel unlike any in Rome. The women who worked there were not slaves or freedwomen from the provinces. They were aristocrats, daughters of ancient families, wives of military commanders, even relatives of senators. Their presence was not voluntary. Messalina wielded her status like a blade, summoning them under threats that could ruin their families. Accusations of treason, the seizure of estates, the disgrace of public scandal. In a society obsessed with honor, the whisper of dishonor could be a death sentence. The villa became a trap, and its bait was irresistible to the powerful men of Rome. Senators, generals, and merchants were invited to exclusive gatherings, thinking themselves honored guests. Once inside, they found themselves drawn into a labyrinth of wine-soaked rooms and shadowy corridors, each leading to a chamber where desire and danger entwined. Every encounter was observed. Hidden servants listened from behind screens, noting every boast, every drunken confession, every whispered betrayal of a political ally. The women themselves, coerced into participation, became agents of intelligence, coaxing secrets from men too intoxicated to guard their tongues. Messalina understood the potency of shame in Roman politics. A man compromised in private could be manipulated in public. Her growing archive of whispered secrets and damning acts became a silent army, one that could be deployed to sway a Senate vote, stall a military appointment, or push through a lucrative trade deal. Soon, her influence seeped into the highest levels of governance. Military commands went to officers she controlled through blackmail. Trade agreements favored merchants entangled in her web. Foreign ambassadors noted Rome's strange new policy shifts. suspecting but never proving that the Empress herself was pulling the strings. In private, Messalina's cruelty deepened. She took pleasure in revealing to certain men after the act that the woman they had just bedded was the wife of a political rival or the daughter of a man whose support they desperately needed. The realization left them stunned, unable to act without destroying themselves. The villa's reputation spread in hushed tones. Men feared the invitations as much as they craved them. Women dreaded the summons, knowing refusal was not an option, and through it all, Messalina moved like a spider at the center of her web, feeding on secrets and watching the most powerful men in Rome dance to her silent music. Yet secrecy was never her true nature. It was only a matter of time before Messalina tired of the shadows and began to stage her power in the light, not just as a seductress, but as a ruler in all but name. By 44 CE, secrecy no longer satisfied Messalina. Her private web of blackmail and coerced alliances had made her one of the most dangerous figures in Rome, but the shadows could not feed her need for spectacle. She wanted the city and especially its elite to see her power with their own eyes. The opportunity lay in religion. Rome's festivals and sacred rites were deeply entwined with public life, and attendance at certain ceremonies was mandatory for senators, magistrates, and their wives. By declaring that her events were restorations of ancient rituals, Messalina could compel the presence of the most powerful citizens under the guise of piety. It began subtly. A religious feast to honor a minor deity would start with solemn prayers and offerings. Then, almost imperceptibly, the nature of the gathering would shift. Wine flowed more freely, the music grew louder, and the performances billed as traditional dances or reenactments took on a carnal intensity. By the time the truth became clear, the guests were already participants in something far from sacred. These were not Bacchic orgies in the wild, but carefully staged spectacles of humiliation. Messalina directed them like a playwright, orchestrating encounters between political rivals, compelling dignitaries to strip and perform before their peers, and seating herself as the watchful empress judge. Her laughter carried across the torchlit courtyards as senators, generals, and their wives were reduced to actors in her theatre of shame. The cruelty was deliberate. She understood that public degradation bound her victims more tightly than private vice ever could. A man humiliated in front of his peers would protect the secret of the gathering with his life, not just his reputation. And because the events were framed as religious obligations, there was no refusing the invitation without drawing suspicion. What made these gatherings truly monstrous was her inclusion of youth. Palace records and later accounts suggest that Messalina recruited the adolescent sons and daughters of Rome's noblest families, presenting their involvement as essential to the authenticity of the rites. For the parents, the choice was impossible. Object and risk imperial wrath, or comply and live under the crushing weight of complicity. In these orchestrated degradations, the Empress had found a weapon more efficient than execution. She could neutralize political threats not by killing her enemies, but by ensuring they lived in perpetual fear of exposure. And unlike a blade, shame did not dull, it deepened over time, eroding a man's confidence, shaping his every decision in the Senate or on the battlefield. Foreign envoys began to notice the change. Senators who once spoke boldly now deferred in silence. Military leaders who had been fierce advocates for their legions grew strangely hesitant in council. Rome's upper class was behaving as though it were held in an invisible chokehold, and at the center of that grip sat Messalina, her power masked by the very ceremonies meant to honor the gods. But for all her cunning, there was one flaw in her strategy: her appetite for escalation. The secrecy of the honey trap had made her untouchable. The public nature of these orgiastic rituals made her infamous, and with each event, the danger to her own position grew. In the autumn of 48 CE, Messalina's hunger for domination reached its most audacious expression, one that shattered even the elastic boundaries of Roman decadence. Emperor Claudius was away in Ostia, overseeing grain shipments, when whispers began to coil through the streets. The Empress was preparing a wedding, not a symbolic ceremony, not a theatrical reenactment of some ancient myth, but a legal marriage, recognized by Roman law. The groom? Gaius Silius, a striking young senator known for his ambition, beauty, and, until then, prudence. The choice was staggering. Under Roman law, marriage between two citizens was binding and could not coexist with an existing marriage. Messalina was, in effect, declaring herself divorced from the emperor without so much as a formal decree. To marry another man while still empress was not merely adultery, it was a political coup disguised as a wedding feast. The celebration itself was a fever dream of excess. For days, the streets near Silius's house blazed with torchlight, the air thick with music, laughter, and the scent of roasting meats. Guests, including much of Rome's still uncompromised aristocracy, were plied with wine and drawn into a spiral of revelry that soon collapsed into a sprawling, unrestrained orgy. What might have been passed off as yet another scandalous night in Rome was, in this case, the opening move of open rebellion. Messalina began referring to Silius as emperor, issuing orders in his name, and speaking of an impending coronation. Her blackmail network had left her convinced that she could replace Claudius outright, that her web of compromised senators, generals, and merchants would ensure a bloodless transfer of power. Silius, for his part, seemed increasingly uneasy. What had begun as a dangerous affair with the empress had become a trap of ambition and treason. He may have believed he could extricate himself quietly, but the machinery of Messalina's fantasy was already in motion. When word reached Claudius through a handful of loyal freedmen, his first reaction was disbelief. Even by Messalina's standards, the idea of marrying another man while still empress in full view of Rome seemed absurd. But as witnesses came forward and documents confirmed the legality of the union, disbelief hardened into alarm. This was no longer a matter of marital betrayal, it was treason. In the eyes of Roman law, Silius now had as legitimate a claim to the emperor's position as Claudius himself. Left unchecked, this act could fracture the empire into rival factions, a civil war sparked not by foreign invasion, but by an imperial bedchamber. Claudius acted with a swiftness rare in his otherwise cautious reign. He abandoned the grain ports, gathered loyal troops, and marched on Rome before Messalina could consolidate her position. The city, sensing the shift in power, began to peel away from her cause. And so the empress who had ruled through shadows and shame now faced the full force of imperial authority in daylight. The confrontation would be swift, and for Messalina, final. The confrontation came not in a senate chamber or on a battlefield, but in the gardens of Lucullus, lush, perfumed, and momentarily silent as Claudius's troops closed in. Messalina, once so assured in her power, seemed caught between two instincts: defiance and desperation. Some accounts say she tried to plead with the emperor, sending frantic messages begging for a private audience. Others claim she maintained her arrogance until the final moment, believing even then that she could seduce her way back into favor. But Claudius had seen enough. His loyal advisors pressed him to act quickly before sentiment or hesitation could weaken his resolve. The order was given. The empress was to die. When the soldiers found her, she hesitated, unable or unwilling to take her own life in the Roman tradition of honorable suicide. It was a centurion who delivered the final blow. Her execution was only the first step in her obliteration. Claudius invoked damnatio memoriae, the formal condemnation of memory, erasing her name from monuments, destroying her likeness in statues, and banning public mention of her existence. To speak of Messalina was, for a time, an act of treason. In the end, the woman who had used shame as her most potent weapon was herself erased by a force more absolute than fear, official forgetting. But the shadow she cast lingered in whispers of an empress who made senators crawl, who turned temples into theatres, who nearly seized the empire through seduction and blackmail. Her downfall marked a turning point. For a brief, dangerous decade, scandal had seemed more powerful than law, and humiliation more effective than the sword. With Messalina's death, Rome returned at least for a while to a more predictable balance of politics and morality. But the lesson was not forgotten. in the corridors of power, desire, and ambition can entwine into something far more dangerous than either alone. If this tale has left you wondering what other secrets have been buried under centuries of dust, you're not alone. History is full of such stories erased, distorted, or left to rot in the shadows waiting for someone bold enough to look closer. If you want to keep uncovering the forbidden, the shocking, and the untold, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter we pull from the dark. And tell me in the comments, which part of Messalina's story shocked you the most? Until next time, thank you for watching and for daring to remember what history tried to forget.